Good morrow and good day, fellow peasants. In this video, I'm going to be reading part of the Wiki page on wage slavery, with the focus being on the psychological effects of wage slavery. But before I do that, I'm going to read the basic description, according to Wikipedia, of what wage slavery actually is. Wage slavery describes a person's dependence on wages or a salary for their livelihood, especially when wages are low, conditions are poor, and there are few realistic chances of upward mobility. The term is often used by critics of work to criticize the exploitation of labor and social stratification, with the former seen primarily as unequal bargaining power between labor and capital, particularly when workers are paid comparatively low wages, such as in sweatshops, and the latter is described as a lack of workers' self-management, fulfilling job choices, and leisure in an economy. The criticism of social stratification covers a wider range of employment choices bound by the pressures of a hierarchical society to perform otherwise unfulfilling work that deprives humans of their species' character, not only under threat of extreme poverty and starvation, but also of social stigma and status diminution. Historically, many socialist organizations and activists have espoused workers' self-management or worker cooperatives as possible alternatives to wage labor. That's really not that surprising, but there definitely is something to be said about that. So let's move on to what I actually wanted to talk about, the psychological effects. So, the psychological effects, self-identity, problems, and stress. According to research, modern work provides people with a sense of personal and social identity that is tied to, number one, the particular work role, even if unfulfilling, and number two, the social role it entails, family breadwinning, friendship forming, and so on. Thus, job loss entails the loss of this identity. Erich Fromm argued that if a person perceives himself as being what he owns, then when that person loses, or even thinks of losing what he owns, the good looks or sharp mind that allowed him to sell his labor for high wages, a fear of loss may create anxiety and authoritarian tendencies because that person's sense of identity is threatened. In contrast, when a person's sense of self is based on what he experiences in a state of being, with a less materialistic regard for what he once had and lost, or may lose, then less authoritarian tendencies prevail. In his view, the state of being flourishes under a worker-managed workplace and economy, whereas self-ownership entails a materialistic notion of self, created to rationalize the lack of worker control that would allow for a state of being. Investigative journalist Robert Kuttner analyzed the work of public health scholars Jeffrey Johnson and Ellen Hall about modern conditions of work and concludes that, quote, to be in a life situation where one experiences relentless demands by others, over which one has relatively little control, is to be at risk of poor health, physically as well as mentally, end quote. Under wage labor, quote, a relatively small elite demands and gets empowerment, self-actualization, autonomy, and other work satisfaction that partially compensate for long hours, while epidemiological data confirm that lower-paid, lower-status workers are more likely to experience the most clinically damaging forms of stress, in part because they have less control over their work, end quote. Wage slavery and the educational system that precedes it, quote, implies power held by the leader. Without power, the leader is inept. The possession of power inevitably leads to corruption, in spite of good intentions. Leadership means power of initiative. This sense of responsibility, the self-respect which comes from expressed manhood, is taken from the men and consolidated in the leader. The sum of their initiative, their responsibility, their self-respect becomes his, and the order and system he maintains is based upon the suppression of men from being independent thinkers into being the men. In a word, he is compelled to become an autocrat and a foe to democracy. That was kind of a mouthful. Excuse me. For the, quote, leader, such marginalization can be beneficial for a leader. Can be seen as beneficial, for a leader sees no need for any high level of intelligence in the rank and file, except to applaud his actions. Indeed, such intelligence from his point of view, by breeding criticism and opposition, is an obstacle and causes confusion. Wage slavery implies erosion of the human personality because some men submit to the will of others, arousing in these instincts which predispose them to cruelty and indifference in the face of the suffering of their fellows. Next one, psychological control, higher wages. In the 19th century discussions of labor relations, it was normally assumed that the threat of starvation forced those without property to work for wages. Proponents of the view that modern forms of employment constitute wage slavery, even when workers appear to have a range of available alternatives, have attributed its perpetuation to a variety of social factors that maintain the hegemony of the employer class. In an account of the Lowell Mill Girls, Harriet Hanson Robinson wrote that generously high wages were offered to overcome the degrading nature of the work. At the time the Lowell cotton mills were started, the caste of the factory girl was the lowest among the employments of women. She was represented as subjected to influences that must destroy her purity and self-respect. In the eyes of her overseer, she was but a brute, a slave to be beaten, pinched, pushed about. It was to overcome this prejudice that such high wages had been offered to women that they might be induced to become mill girls, in spite of the opprobrium that still clung to this degrading occupation. In his book, Disciplined Minds, Jeff Schmidt points out that professionals are trusted to run organizations in the interests of their employers, because employers cannot be on hand to manage every decision. Professionals are trained to ensure that each and every detail of their work favors the right interests or skewers the disfavored ones in the absence of overt control. In the absence of overt control, the resulting professional is an obedient thinker, an intellectual property whom employers can trust to experiment, theorize, innovate, and create safely within the confines of an assigned ideology. Paracon, participatory economics theory, posits a social class between labor and capital of higher paid professionals such as doctors, lawyers, engineers, managers, and others who monopolize empowering labor and constitute a class above wage laborers who do mostly obedient rote work. Next section, lower wages. The terms employee or worker have often been replaced by associate. This plays up the allegedly voluntary nature of the interaction while playing down the subordinate status of the wage laborer, as well as the worker-boss class distinction emphasized by labor movements. Billboards, as well as television, internet, and newspaper advertisements consistently show low-wage workers with smiles on their faces appearing happy. Yeah, no fucking shit. See that everywhere. Job interviews and other data on requirements for lower skilled workers in developed countries, particularly in the growing service sector, indicate that the more workers depend on low wages and the less skilled or desirable their job is, the more employers screen for workers without better employment options and expect them to feign remunerative motivation. Such screening and feigning may not only contribute to the positive self-image of the employer as someone granting desirable employment, but also signal wage dependence by indicating the employee's willingness to feign, which in turn may discourage the dissatisfaction normally associated with the job switching or union activity. At the same time, employers in the service industry have justified unstable part-time employment and low wages by playing down the importance of service jobs for the lives of the wage laborers. Just temporary before finding something better, student summer jobs, and things of the like. In the early 20th century, scientific methods of strike-bearing were devised, employing a variety of tactics that emphasized how strikes undermined harmony and Americanism. So that is the section that I wanted to read to you guys. Thanks for stopping by and listening. And until then, goodbye, and I'll see you peasants later.